Environmental Policymaking in the Era of Climate Change is the latest book written by College of Charleston professor Dr. Matthew Nowlin. I sit down one-on-one with Dr. Nowlin for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Listen to this interview Tuesday on my free Quintin's Close-Ups iHeartRadio podcast. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Dr. Matthew Nowlin, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks, Quintin. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. We're sitting here in your office in downtown Charleston, and obviously you are a political science professor here at the College of Charleston.
Yes, that's correct. My research and teaching in political science is focused on public policy, environmental policy, and climate change specifically.
Let me talk to you about climate change, because obviously you just came out with a new book just recently called this, Environmental Policymaking in the Era of Climate Change. And let me go to the description of it on the website here. It says this: as the world considers how to deal with the impacts of a changing climate, it's vital that we understand the ways in which the United States policymaking process addresses environmental issues. What are the impacts of climate change right now?
Well, we're seeing some of the impacts both globally, nationally, and even here in Charleston. So, as you may have seen, July was the hottest month ever recorded. Just last month. And we're seeing in Charleston, we're probably aware of the increase in flooding, in so-called sunny day flooding or tidal flooding. And that's a large part a result of sea level rise. So as the earth warms, as the temperature of the earth warms, sea expands, and as it warms, ice also melts, land ice also melts, and both of those contribute to sea level rise, which we're seeing right here in Charleston.
How much will the sea rise 5-10 years from now?
That's a good question. There's a lot of estimates and a lot of uncertainty, but I believe here in Charleston, in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be noticeable, but not perhaps. Some of the time scales that we're looking at are up to 50 years out, right? So we're expecting up to 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise here in Charleston.
Now, just the other day, as you know, they had the Dutch dialogues about the flooding here in Charleston.
Yes.
What dialogue should they be having now about flooding in Charleston?
So I think the Dutch dialogues was a great way that Charleston locally is thinking about these issues. So I think a lot of areas, so South Carolina is a more conservative, politically speaking state, and when we think about environmental issues, they tend to be identified with the left or the liberals or the Democratic Party. But even in a conservative state like Charleston, since we're a coastal state and we're seeing some of these things happening, at the state level, although we may not call it climate change, we talk about it in terms of flooding. But we're actually doing quite a few things. So the Dutch dialogue is part of that. The city of Charleston has a sea level rise plan that they've put in place, and they've used some of the latest science coming from the federal government. Mm-hmm. So the National Climate Assessment is used in those in the planning sort of process. So we're actually seeing it in terms of adaptation. So when we think about climate policy, we tend to think in terms of either mitigation, so policies that would reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting, or adaptation policies that are aimed at adapting to some of the changes that we're already seeing. So the city of Charleston in particular is doing quite a bit on the adaptation front, certainly with regard to flooding.
And what else should be in that plan in your mind when you think of flooding?
So what I think probably in the next 10 to 20 years, we may need, depending on, there's uncertainty with the estimates of how much sea level rise and how much increase in flooding we'll see. But based on the latest estimates, we're probably going to have to think about and maybe make some hard decisions about areas with which we need to perhaps abandon, right? So we may need to make some hard choices about moving some resources and people closer inland as the sea level rise increases. So I think that's going to be a difficult conversation, but I think that's one that we may need to think about starting to have in the next 10 years or so.
And let me get back to your book,
Sure.
Environmental Policymaking in the Era of Climate Change. Let me go back to what I just read a second ago. As the world considers how to deal with the impacts of a changing climate, it's vital that we understand the ways in which the United States policy-making process that is, address environmental issues. What issues are the government addressing right now in your mind?
Well, with regard to climate change, we're not really doing much, particularly at the federal level. So what I looked at in the book is why, when the science is settled, in the sense that there's a consensus that climate change is happening, that the average temperature of the Earth is increasing due entirely to human influences. So what I looked at in the book is what are some of the reasons as to why at the federal government level we haven't addressed that. And so part of the reasons that I talk about is the sort of nature of climate change is what we think of as a collective action problem, where the actions of one state or country in the absence of action by others won't do much to address the overall problem. So for example, if the United States tomorrow stops emitting any greenhouse gases, there's still other countries like China and India that continue to produce. So the overall effect may not be as strong, as effective. So that's by definition this nature of collective action sort of problem. So that's one piece of it that I look at. And the nature of our institutions in the United States, right? They're very fragmented, powers diffused across 3 branches of the federal government, across the 50 different states and local governments. So when you have that sort of diffusion of power, it was by design to keep safeguard against tyranny, right? In the mind of the founders. But what that does is it makes it a little more difficult for large-scale policy change to happen. So just the nature of diffuse policymaking authority is another thing I examine in the book. And then the sort of values and beliefs that the public holds, but also policy makers and elected officials hold, right? So particularly about the role of government. So climate change is one of the most polarized political issues. And part of the reason for that is what scholars have called solution aversion. So if you're a conservative or a conservative Republican, by definition, you're concerned about sort of government overreach or government control of the economy and government regulation. And a lot of the proposed solutions to climate change have involved some of that, right? Some government regulation, some government interference in the economy. So as a conservative, if one of your sort of core values is that you don't think it's good for government to interfere, and then you're presented with a problem, and the solution is, some government regulation of the economy, then you're going to sort of reason yourself backwards to think if that's the solution, this must not be a problem, right?
And let's say, for instance, let's put it into a math problem here.
Okay.
The economy plus climate change equals what to you?
That's interesting. So there are. It's going to have. So the economy is dynamic by nature, right? So it changes a lot. Industries come and go a lot.
Sure.
So climate change is going to have a disruptive impact on the economy, right? So there's some estimates of multiple trillions of dollars that by the end of the century, the climate change will have cost the economy, and things like lost production, because there's all sorts of potential impacts in terms of health and everything. So putting all these together, climate change itself, left unchecked, could have these huge negative impacts of the economy coming throughout the rest of the century. And part of the political debate, though, is the cost to the economy that any particular solution would propose. So if we're thinking about mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases, then the ways to do that is to reduce energy production and consumption for certain types of energy, of fossil fuel energy in particular, right? And that will have some cost to the economy. It'll have some cost to those industries. But the cost to those industries is a lot less than the overall cost to the economy if we don't do anything, right? So it's going to be disruptive either way. So the question is, And the longer we wait to start to mitigate and reduce greenhouse gases, the more it's going to cost.
Going to cost.
Right.
And let me get back to what you said in the description of your book. It says this: a mix of existing theory and original analysis, environmental policymaking in the era of climate change applies recent policy scholarship to questions of environmental governance, with a particular focus on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The book examines how competing political actors influence policies within and across institutions, focusing on both a macro level where formal bodies set the agenda and a meso level where issues are contained within policy subsystems.
Mm-hmm.
Let me reread that again.
Yes, there's some academic jargon in there for sure.
Exactly right. The book examines how competing political actors influence policies.
Mm-hmm.
How is that happening now?
Well, we're seeing certainly at the federal level, right? So with the Trump administration and conservatives are, because of the way our institutions are designed, are able to block a lot of action that perhaps the House Democrats would want to see on issues like climate change.
Climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And you also said this too, focusing on both a macro level where formal bodies set the agenda. How's that agenda looking now?
Well, with regard to climate change, it's the House. So when I do this in the book, and when policy scholars think about agenda and agenda setting, right, they're thinking about the issues that are getting the attention of policymakers. And one way to measure that is congressional hearings, right? So the number of hearings that Congress is holding about climate change. And so one of the things I find in the book is because I should say that when we think about agenda setting and the things that might influence agenda setting, again, we're the idea that when we're talking about agenda setting, we're talking about policymakers paying attention to particular issues over other issues. All right. So some of the things that might make it more likely that policymakers will pay attention and include some indicators. So things like the level of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, right? As that increases, this sort of changing and extreme sort of weather events like the hurricanes. Although and science is getting better at being able to attribute the likelihood of certain events to climate change, right? So the amount of rain that happened as a result with Hurricane Harvey and with Hurricane Florence.
Right.
So as the atmosphere warms, it's able to hold more water vapor, therefore to produce more rain. So attribution science is getting better at saying that climate change made the rain events in Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Florence much more likely. So things like that tend to be the things that get the attention of policymakers. And then there was some research that was published about 6 or 7 years ago that looked at congressional hearings about climate change up to 2005 and found that some of these things did in fact influence attention to climate change by Congress. But what I found in my book, extending that analysis up until 2016, I found that those things didn't seem to matter as much with regard to congressional agenda setting or congressional attention. And the only thing that mattered was whether or not the Democrats held a majority in the chamber holding the hearing. And we're seeing that play out now after the 2018 elections where Democrats took control of the House. We're seeing quite a few more hearings about climate change taking place in the House than we have seen in the last several years that Republicans had control.
And let me get back to book 2. The publisher basically says this: divided into 2 sections, the book incorporates insights from political science and public policy to provide the reader with a better understanding of how environmental policy decisions are made.
Mm-hmm.
Part 1 offers a framework for understanding environmental policy making, exploring the history of environmental policy, and discussing that is, the importance of values in environmental policy.
Mm-hmm.
What are those values now?
Well, so when we talk about values, I'm thinking about things like political ideology, and then there's some work on what scholars have called cultural theory, which look at how people think about how society should be organized, how power in society should be organized. So they look at with regard to clearly demarcated lines of authority, so like hierarchies versus less hierarchical, and then they look at it in terms of group commitments, so more individualistic versus more communitarian. And so depending on where you fall on those sorts of values, and some of this overlaps, there is some overlap that scholars have shown with these types of what they call cultural theory values with political ideology. Right, so those that are a little more hierarchical and individualistic tend to be a little more conservative / Republican. Those that are a little less hierarchical, a little more egalitarian or communitarian tend to be more liberal, more democratic. Right, so I look at some of those values, and depending on how you think society should be structured, that influences what you think is risky. And so a lot of scholars have looked at this in terms of environmental governance with regard to risk. So how much risk does climate change pose? Well, if you tend to be more concerned about the community as a whole versus individual liberty, then you tend to be more concerned about the potential impacts that climate change might have. But if, going back to the discussion about, those policies that have been proposed,
Sure.
if you're talking about regulations of coal plants, for example, or regulations of fossil fuel industries, then you're sort of infringing on what a more individualistic cultural type would think is risky, right? So the risk for an individualist is over-regulation by the government versus what a egalitarian or communitarian would think in terms of the overall well-being of the community and the risk posed by changes in the climate.
And when you look at the society today, how should it be structured in your mind?
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm sort of somewhere in between the sort of individualists and communitarian aspects, right? So I should say I am for whatever policy approach could possibly work to reduce our emission of greenhouse gases. So that includes things like a carbon tax, right? So we make it more expensive, which would then incentivize people to use it less. To parts of the Green New Deal, right? The parts that particularly include, increased government funding for research and development of alternative energies. So I think, anything that, I think we need to be having a conversation across the ideological divide about policy approaches to climate change. And I'm for talking about any potential approach to climate.
And what was that funding like before?
What was the funding?
Yes, sir.
Like before the current administration
or any of them?
Prior
to this issue becoming as big as it is now.
Right. So, there is a partisan divide, clearly. And one of the things that, you mentioned funding in particular, one of the things I show in the book, I look at the budget for the Environmental Protection Agency. And I find that in periods of unified democratic control, where there's both a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, and this occurred during some years in the Carter administration, first couple of years of the Clinton administration, and in the first couple of years of the Obama administration. Right, all those periods saw higher levels of funding for the Environmental Protection Agency. Right, so. But in terms of climate specifically, there are aspects of the federal government that does climate research, split across several agencies from NASA to NOAA,
right.
That produce, that measure how much carbon dioxide is currently in the atmosphere. Right, we're greater than 410 parts per million, which is a level we haven't seen in at least 400,000 years. Right, so that work continues, but then at higher levels of the Trump administration in particular, right, we're seeing sort of a pullback, things like stepping away from the Paris Climate Agreement to trying to roll back some of the executive actions and regulations that the Obama administration put in place. So a lot of those have been challenged in court. So we're sort of in a holding pattern with regard to a lot of those. And, and funding for the Environmental Protection Agency is and other agencies, of course, has been reduced.
What good has Republicans done on climate change?
That's a good question. So, So if we go back, I talk about this some in the book, but if we go back to the early 1970s, when environmentalism as a whole was really first came to the sort of a forefront, right? It was, Republican President Nixon actually did quite a lot on the environment, right? He started the Environmental Protection Agency. He supported Clean Air Act and other sorts of environmental regulations. And it really wasn't until and even so Reagan was concerned about he was concerned about sort of government regulation across a whole host of areas, including environmental issues. But there was, even during that time, there was some recognition within the administration that climate change might have been a problem. And then George H.W. Bush, when he first ran for president in 1988, ran as an environmentalist. He ran saying, "I will be an environmental president." And he even had the line that said, "There's a greenhouse effect, but wait until they see the White House effect." Right. So, but it seems to be so. So there's this sort of growing polarization on environmental issues, and I do talk about this a little bit in the book as well. On the environment that started in the 80s, but then really started to grow into the early 90s. So by the time we get to the 92 election, we've got Bill Clinton and Al Gore.
Right.
Al Gore has a history of working on environmental issues.
Sure.
So to differentiate himself and to shore up his conservative base, George H.W. Bush sort of went from saying I'm going to be an environmental president to being more the sort of conservative Republican line on issues of the environment. So the history, I think, in large part, at least at the elected official level, goes back to really the sort of ideological divides about the role of government and what that implies for climate change. And among the public, they've sort of followed this elite polarization, right? So those that consider themselves among the public to be conservative or Republican have been following the lead and become more polarized really since the early 90s on all sorts of environmental issues. And then climate change in particular really became polarized in the late 90s around the Kyoto Protocol debate,
right,
where you had Clinton and the Clinton administration on the one hand and Republicans in Congress on the other. So that really seemed to work to exacerbate the polarization. But there was a report over the weekend in the New York Times that talked about how younger Republicans and younger conservatives are more concerned about climate change. There was recently several Republican former officials like George Schultz and others that have come out in support of a carbon tax, right, which is sort of a market-based solution to climate change. So there seems to be now, and with things like the Green New Deal and the Sunrise Movement, right, there seems to be this sort of grassroots movement and concern and interest about climate change. So it'd be interesting to see whether Republicans, how they respond to some of that grassroots concern about climate change that seems to be increasing.
And lastly, what have Democrats done wrong when it comes to climate change?
Oh, that's a good question too. So certainly they've, they're not innocent in terms of the polarization on these issues, right? So, and when we think about polarized issues like climate change, we want to think about, we often think about this question of do we want to mobilize our side or do we want to try and persuade those on the other side? So Democrats, I think have been more on the sort of mobilizing people on our side sort of thing, and that is then creates a sort of counter mobilization, right? So think about people like Al Gore has been, we had the Inconvenient Truth in 2007, 2006 about climate change issues. Of course, Al Gore after the 2000 election and even before that is, seen as somewhat of a polarizing figure. So if Al Gore becomes sort of the face of climate change, then that's good for people that already agree with Democrats on some of these issues, but it creates it could potentially create a sort of a backlash among conservatives and Republicans, right? So so I think one thing perhaps Democrats can do is really think about what the sort of impacts that mobilizing their side might have on the other side, and think about things like, pursuing things like renewable energy isn't, currently as polarized as it might be as a way to address climate change, because there's lots of reasons other than just climate change to support renewable energy that conservatives and Republicans may be on board with in terms of innovation and technological development, right? So maybe pushing some policy solutions that aren't as polarized is one thing that I think Democrats can do a little bit better.
And I want to tell people, pick up your book, Environmental Policymaking in an Era of Climate Change. Is available at Amazon, wherever else where you can find your books.
Exactly.
And again, Dr. Matthew Nowlin, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yes, sir. Likewise. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.